Is your story ready for submission? That's what we're going to find out. This is Journey to KidLit with Brooke Van Sickle, episode number 3. Welcome to the Journey to KidLit podcast. I'm your host, Brooke Van Sickle, and each week on the show, we'll discuss what it takes to write, publish, and market your kids' book. Let's get started. This episode is brought to you by BiblioKid Publishing, the children's book publisher that donates 50% of their profits back to education. For a look at their books or to learn more, visit BiblioKidPublishing.com. Hey there, and welcome to the Journey to KidLit podcast. I'm so glad you're here. As always, I'm your host, Brooke Van Sickle, and on today's episode, we're going to dive into what makes a story ready to send to potential agents and editors. I get asked this question all the time, and sometimes I still ask myself this question. How do you know it's the right time to start submitting your story? It's a good question. You don't want to send out a story that's not ready, but you also don't want to edit a story so much that you never attempt to publish it. So when is the right time? There are 3 things you need to do before you submit a story. First, you need to make sure it's well written. If you've been doing your research, you know the components that make a strong story. You know who your character is, you write in a way that's showing and not telling, and you have a strong plot. If you haven't done that, then you definitely need to do the research for all of that first. There are 3 books that help me with this: Story Genius, Plot Perfect, and Self-Editing for Fiction Writers. I read those the summer I quit my job to write full-time, and there's a night and day difference in my writing since then. But I would never know I had a well-written story without my critique group. These ladies have seen some of my worst drafts and some of the best. There are some times when I take my story to them only to have them read it and find all these flaws, even though all I want them to do is tell me how amazing I am. But that's not their job. If you haven't joined a critique group yet, I highly recommend you find one to bring your work to. Once you know your story is well written, the next thing you need to do is make sure it's formatted correctly. Even though 90% of our submissions are going to be through email, you still need to set up your story in the right format. There are some times when you're going to have to send in hard copies or attachments of your manuscript, and the fastest way to get a no is looking like you don't know what you're doing. Proper format is Times New Roman 12-point font with 1-inch margins, and your contact info will go in the upper left-hand corner, while the word count and genre will be in the upper right-hand corner. And then you list your title about halfway down the page. Don't worry about having to write all of that down. The link to the steps to format your story will be in the show notes. The third thing you need to do before you submit is know how to precisely pitch your story. Have you ever asked someone what their story is about, and they launch into this 10-minute monologue trying to explain the book to you, and your eyes start to glaze over because you thought this would be like a 2-second thing? Has that writer ever been you? When you submit your story, you don't get 10 minutes. In fact, you get less than 300 words and sometimes just a sentence or 2 to intrigue an agent or editor. So knowing what your story is about is very important. And don't worry, you're actually the expert here. You wrote the story. Who knows it better than you? A quick way to pitch someone your story is to create a USP. This is a unique selling proposition. It's a unique way to compare your story to things that the reader already knows. For instance, the YA series The Selection. A good USP for that would be The Hunger Games meets The Bachelor. You can already picture what this story is about, even if you have no idea what that book is. Or if you think about the popular production West Side Story, a USP for that would be Romeo and Juliet, but in 1950s New York. Again, you can picture exactly what the book is without having to read any part of the manuscript. That's what you need to do with your USP. Think about a book that people would know in your genre that's similar to your story, but then add what makes it different, and that's your USP. And those are the 3 things that you need to do before you submit a story. Have a well-written manuscript, make sure it's properly formatted, and know how you plan to pitch it. I know it sounds pretty simple because it is, but there is a lot of work that will go into that before you start sending. And I recommend getting your query critiqued before you send it out too, just to make sure you're selling your story well enough before you try it out on industry professionals. I know a lot of writers can get stuck at this spot and they never end up sending out their stories because you don't feel like you're good enough or no one will want it. But how are you going to know unless you try? If you've done the 3 steps, then your story is probably ready. And if you submit and don't get any yeses, there's nothing that says you can't tweak things and try again. Sometimes you change your query letter or your hook, and other times you rewrite your whole story. That's just publishing. I have a book I've been working on for 5 years. I've rewritten it countless times at this point, and I'm still sending it out. Right now, I'm not because I'm editing it, but I will send it out again. It's just one of those books that I know is going to get published eventually. It just hasn't found its person yet. And the same thing can be said about your story. Until you put yourself out there, you're never going to get published. So get your story ready and start sending it out. You're only one no away from that yes. And that about does it for today's episode of the Journey to KidLit podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you learned a little bit today. As always, I love to hear from you. So if you have a thought about today's episode or a suggestion for future ones, be sure to reach out via email or on Twitter. And if you liked what you heard today, I would love for you to leave a review. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to be notified of new episodes. We have new episodes that come out every Saturday, so don't miss out. Until next time, happy writing!